Hey, what is up? My name is Natalia and welcome back to my online workshop where dance and film collide. Today, we're going to be digging into Chapter 3, DSLR Basics for Filmmaking. If you are a photographer and you're used to DSLR cameras, stick around because I'm going to be talking about some of the key differences between using a DSLR for photography versus video. And if you're someone who is completely overwhelmed by DSLR cameras, please stick around because we'll be talking about just 4 key concepts that you need to be successful with this bad boy. And if that still feels intimidating to you, don't worry because you can use some of these concepts on your cell phone and I'll be giving you some details about how to do that at the end of this video. But first, let's dig into the 4 key concepts we need to understand in order to use our DSLR camera. ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and white balance. Let's start off with ISO. So ISO basically refers to how sensitive either your film is or your digital sensor. So if you've ever purchased a roll of film, you know that you have to purchase film with a specific ISO, and that ISO corresponds to how sensitive that roll of film is to light. 100 ISO is not very sensitive to light, so you can take it into really bright areas and it won't become overexposed. 400 ISO is much more sensitive to light, and so you can take it into darker spaces and it'll still be able to pick up all of those small, dim particles of light and create an image. ISO is pretty important to understand when it comes to your equipment because the biggest difference that you'll find in entry-level cameras and pro-level cameras is the sensitivity of their sensors. So if you are working with an entry or cheaper camera, you'll be able to get really high quality footage if you have a lot of light and you're able to keep that ISO really low. However, if you are working in dimmer settings, you're going to need a sensor that is able to pick up those small particles of light without losing image quality. If you are using a low-level camera and you're bumping up your ISO to 1600, 2000, 3500, what you'll find is that it will begin to get very grainy and the quality of that footage will quickly diminish. That's just something to understand, and if you are working with an entry-level camera, which I suggest in the beginning, just know that you'll need to work with a lot of light. Aperture. How open or closed the hole is that lets light into that sensor. It works very much like the pupils of our eyes. So a nice experiment that you can do to understand this is to go into a very bright room or a bright bathroom and close your eyes. Allow yourself a couple of minutes so that your eyes can get used to that dark space and they're going to open up. Then open your eyes and look at yourself in the mirror. What you will see is your pupils quickly contracting. Our camera needs to work in much the same way. The more open it is, the more light it lets in, the more closed down it is, the less light it will let in. Aperture is measured in f-stops, and the smaller the f-stop number, the more open that aperture. The higher that f-stop number, the smaller the aperture. The other thing to understand with aperture is that it corresponds with depth of field. So it's sometimes easy to think about this in terms of a football field. The higher the depth of field, the more of that field you'll be able to see in focus. And it really is a front to back situation. So the more both the foreground and the background will be in focus. The smaller your aperture or more open your aperture is, the shallower your depth of field will be, meaning that only one strip of that football field will be in focus versus the entire field. It means that there's going to be more separation between the foreground and the background, and things are going to feel further apart in the front back space. The other thing to recognize when it comes to depth of field is that we humans have a quite shallow depth of field naturally when we look out on the world. So if you want your footage to feel more cinematic, then you're going to want a shallower depth of field. That's one thing that you'll notice almost immediately if you're moving from a cell phone to a DSLR camera. You're able to get that depth of field for the first time, and it's going to immediately elevate your footage and make it feel more realistic and cinematic because it replicates how we see the world more realistically. The third thing I want us to talk about is shutter speed. And shutter speed can feel sometimes, I think, a little bit complicated when it comes to filmmaking, but there's a formula to it, so you can also just kind of memorize what's happening and you're good to go. But as a quick understanding of what shutter speed is, it's essentially how long the sensor is exposed to light. It's really nice and clear on cameras like this that have a mirror in them. So if you have a very slow shutter speed, it means that sensor is exposed to light for a really long time. If, however, you have a much faster shutter speed, then it's only exposed to light for a moment. Faster shutter speeds are typically used for actions like a dance, where you want to capture fast-moving objects in space like they're frozen. Whereas a longer shutter speed is typically used for something like capturing the stars at night, where there's not a lot of light and that sensor needs time to take in as much light as possible. When it comes to filming and video, there is a set shutter speed that corresponds to how we see motion in real life, which, if you start to pay attention to how you view the world, you'll realize there is natural motion blur in what we see. And so if you're a photographer, it might feel surprising how low the shutter speed is. The shutter speed also corresponds in filmmaking to the frames per second. Frames per second refers to how many photos or how many frames we see per second of footage. So if you can think about back in the day when people used to crank films, it's how fast they used to crank. And what they've realized over time is that 24 frames per second most closely corresponds to how we view things in real life. And that your shutter speed should always be twice what the frames per second is, again, to replicate how we take in the world naturally. There's a set formula. You either can choose between 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. 24 frames per second is considered the most realistic and the most cinematic. 30 frames per second is often used in television and sports and things that have faster action. Your shutter speed is going to always correspond to your frames per second, and it's always going to be twice your frames per second. So if you are shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed is going to be 50. If you are shooting at 30 frames per second, your shutter speed is going to be at 60. If you want to do slow motion, then you have to decide beforehand, because slow motion is basically inserting additional frames as you are shooting, and then you're elongating it out so that it still corresponds to how we naturally view things at 24 or 30 frames per second. So if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you're able to make that twice as slow when you edit it. I know. But stay with me, we're almost done with this little part, and then the more you play with it, the more you'll understand it. So if you want to do slow motion, you're probably going to be choosing either between shooting at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. And if you're bumping up those frames per second, you also need to bump up your shutter speed, because remember, we always want it to be twice the number. Last thing I'm going to say about this, and if you're a photographer, you've probably realized having a shutter speed of 1/50 or 1/60 in conjunction with an aperture of 1.4 or 2, which is very, very, very open, you're letting in a lot of light. And if you are shooting outside in the California sun, your footage is going to be completely overexposed. So if you still want that beautiful shallow depth of field with the low aperture number, big aperture, you're going to need to find a way to darken your footage because your shutter speed is set. That's where ND filters come in, and those can be a godsend if you're shooting outside in bright light. ND filters are essentially sunglasses that you put in the front of your lens that darken the entire image. And if you know that you're going to be working outside in bright light, I highly suggest you get a variable ND filter, which allows you to change how dark you want that filter to be in the front of your lens. All right, so ISO, shutter speed, aperture. These are all ways that we control how much light is coming into our camera. The last thing I want to talk about today is white balance. And unlike those other three, white balance is something that you can fix later if you have to. But it can be a nightmare, which is why we want to set it beforehand. And the reason why we have to set it is because light comes in different wavelengths, which makes it different colors or temperatures. Natural light is quite cool or blue, and incandescent candle light or sunset light is quite warm or orange. And when we are setting white balance, what we are trying to do is make sure that white always looks white, so that it doesn't look really blue in some areas and really orange in others. But when it comes to filming, if you have your camera on auto balance, what it will do is it will calculate in a particular moment how much blue versus how much orange light you have and try to calibrate the camera accordingly. So if you are really close to a window, it will automatically cool everything in that shot, versus if you're close to an incandescent light, it'll warm up that entire shot. If you are shooting from different angles, depending on how much window or how much natural light you have, your walls or your skin color will start to look entirely different. Your footage won't match, and it'll be a nightmare for you after the fact. So we're not going to dig too much into color theory or how to set white balance using various tools, but all I'm going to say is set it. Get it off of auto so that editing becomes an easier task for you. So that's it for today. Those are the 4 key things that I want you to understand. ISO. If you're using an entry-level camera, we're sticking to 100 or 200 ISO. If you've got a more complicated camera, maybe you can bump it up all the way to, 3,000, 30,000. Yeah, but in general, we're keeping it pretty low. Shutter speed. We're either corresponding that to 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, or we're going into slow motion, and that shutter speed is staying at either 1/50, 1/60, or doubling what our frames per second is. Aperture. We have a really low f-stop or open aperture if we want a shallow depth of field, or we have a very high aperture number, smaller hole, wider depth of field so that we can see more things in focus. We have ND filters if we need to add sunglasses to our camera, and then we are setting our white balance. If you are overwhelmed by using an actual physical DSLR camera, or you just want to play with these concepts on your cell phone, I highly suggest you download the app Filmmaking Pro. I'm sure there are others out there, but that's my go-to for controlling ISO, white balance, all of these things. And then in addition, it also has some stability software in there that allows you to capture some really, really smooth footage. So it's a really great place to start and play with some of these concepts, and then get your hands on a DSLR camera, try it out, see what you can do, play around with it, have fun, and I guarantee you will be off to the races. All right, now that you understand your camera, we are going to move forward. We're going to set up our gimbal and we're going to get to some shooting.